It was supposed to be a dream come true. A young man from the East, eager to meet his online girlfriend of 2 years, someone he thought he knew better than anyone. But nothing could have prepared him for the truth that awaited him in Texas. It was a relationship that had blossomed online, full of late-night chats, shared secrets, and promises to meet in person. She was everything he had wanted, beautiful, caring, and the love of his life. Or so he thought. When he boarded the plane to Texas, his heart raced with excitement. He could almost hear her voice in his head, imagining the warmth of her embrace. But the moment he laid eyes on her in the crowded cafe, everything changed. What he saw made his stomach twist, his heart stop. She wasn't the woman he had pictured. She wasn't even close. The truth was so much more complicated, so much darker, and in that split second, everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and human nature was shattered. How could this happen? How could he go from online love to cold-blooded murder in a matter of minutes? The answer lies in the terrifying moment when his expectations were shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. His actions after that fateful encounter would send shockwaves through everyone who ever believed in the purity of online relationships. They had met on an online dating platform, a space where connection seemed easy, where love felt instant and effortless. For weeks, they exchanged messages talking about their hopes, fears, and dreams. The girl, 22 years old, was everything he had hoped for. Her profile photos were stunning: long blonde hair, sparkling blue eyes, and a smile that promised warmth and kindness. She would send him sweet messages, telling him he was the one she'd been waiting for. To him, their relationship felt more real than anything else in his life. They talked every day, sometimes for hours, about everything and nothing. He had never met anyone so easy to talk to, someone who seemed to understand him in a way no one else had. As their conversations grew deeper, he began to share more personal things. His fears, his dreams, even the darkest parts of his past. She listened and comforted him, offering support like no one else had. The anticipation of finally meeting her in person grew with each passing day. He believed he knew everything about her. Her voice was soothing, and they had shared intimate moments over the phone. She told him about her life in Texas, how she had always wanted to find someone like him. It was a relationship built on trust, or so he thought. But no amount of late-night confessions or promises could prepare him for the shocking truth that would emerge when they finally met. The decision to meet had been a long time coming. After months of chatting online, he was finally ready to take the leap. They had talked about it often, how wonderful it would be to hold each other in person, to step out of the virtual world and into reality. He had spent weeks planning for the trip, making sure everything was perfect. This would be the moment that proved their connection was real, that love could transcend digital screens and become something tangible. He booked the flight to Texas, telling himself that this was going to be the best moment of his life. The closer the date came, the more nervous he became. There were butterflies in his stomach, and every text from her seemed to deepen his excitement. They had talked about where they'd meet, what they'd do, even what they would wear. She promised him she would be waiting at the cafe, wearing a red dress that would make her stand out. He imagined how it would feel to walk up to her, finally holding the woman he'd dreamed of for so long. But somewhere deep down, doubt began to creep in. As much as he tried to push it away, a nagging feeling kept whispering in his mind. What if she wasn't exactly what she seemed? What if, in the end, all this time he had spent building this online connection would crumble in the face of reality? The moment he saw her in the cafe, the world seemed to stand still. She was sitting at a corner table, just like she had said, wearing the red dress. He could hardly believe he was finally seeing her in person. The woman he had spoken to for months was sitting just a few feet away from him, looking just as beautiful as her photos, yet something about the scene felt off. As he walked toward her, his heart raced in his chest. She smiled at him warmly, and the butterflies in his stomach intensified. It was everything he had imagined, until it wasn't. Something in the way she looked at him made him pause. Her eyes seemed uncertain, her smile a little too wide, almost forced. The excitement in his chest began to turn into confusion. They exchanged pleasantries, sitting down and starting to talk. He noticed how stiff her body language was, how her movements seemed calculated. But he brushed it off, convincing himself it was just the nerves of finally meeting in person. He felt a strange sense of unease, though he couldn't place why. But then, as the conversation flowed and they laughed together, it happened. She made a comment that caught him off guard, something about her past, a quick slip of the tongue that made his mind race. Was it a joke? A sign? He couldn't tell, but something was happening. The woman in front of him wasn't who he thought she was. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. There was something deeper, something darker lurking beneath the surface. The moment everything changed came so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that it left him breathless. They were sitting there, talking when the truth came out. It wasn't something that could have been predicted, nor could it have been something he could have prepared himself for. She had casually mentioned it as if it were no big deal, like it was just another piece of information he should accept without question. But those words hit him like a ton of bricks. "You know, I was born male," she said, looking down at her coffee, her voice almost trembling. The room seemed to freeze. His mind went blank for a moment, the words hanging in the air like poison. His eyes widened in shock, and for a split second he couldn't process what had just been said. He asked her to repeat herself, but she didn't. Her gaze met his, filled with a kind of vulnerability, a raw honesty that he hadn't expected to encounter. He couldn't believe it. Everything he had built in his mind about who she was, all the trust and love, shattered in an instant. The thoughts raced through his mind, confusion flooding his senses. Could he believe her? Was this a joke? No, this was too real. He could see it in her eyes, the fear, the shame, the uncertainty. But for him, this revelation was more than just unexpected. It felt like a betrayal. His heart pounded in his chest and his thoughts spiraled. His love, his connection, the perfect image he had crafted in his mind, it was all a lie. The girl he had come to love was not who he thought she was. His emotions, once filled with affection, now swirled with anger, confusion, and resentment. The world around him seemed to disappear as his emotions overwhelmed him. The shock and confusion of the revelation triggered something deep inside him, a surge of anger, fear, and disgust that he couldn't control. The anger wasn't just directed at her, it was at himself, at the vulnerability he had allowed himself to experience. How could he have been so foolish, so trusting? He stood up abruptly, pacing around the small cafe, his mind racing, his hands trembling. She didn't follow him, didn't try to calm him down. Instead, she sat there watching him, her face filled with fear. It was as if she knew what was coming. "I don't know who you are," he shouted, his voice rising. "You lied to me. You deceived me." He couldn't understand how this had happened, how everything he had felt for her had been built on lies. She tried to explain, tried to say something, but he couldn't hear her. His vision blurred with rage. In a moment of pure panic and fury, he snapped. The person he had thought was his soulmate, his love, had betrayed him in a way that felt unbearable. It was too much. His thoughts clouded, and before he knew what he was doing, he had done the unthinkable. The next few minutes felt like a blur. He didn't even understand the full extent of what had happened. The shock hadn't worn off, and his adrenaline was pumping through him like wildfire. He had just killed her. He had let the raw emotions take over, and now there was no going back. The silence in the cafe was deafening after the chaos. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his mind in complete turmoil. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. The moment of rage, the boiling over of emotions, had left him paralyzed with disbelief. He had killed the woman he had once loved. For a moment he just stared at her lifeless body. His breath came in shallow gasps, and every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to escape before anyone found out what he had done. But something deeper, something darker weighed on him, guilt. His hand shook as he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His mind raced through the possible consequences, the reality of his actions finally starting to set in. He dialed 911, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke to the dispatcher. I've done something horrible," he managed to choke out. "I need help." He didn't wait for them to arrive. Instead, he stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. His thoughts were a whirlwind of panic and regret. The love he had felt for her was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of shame. What had he done? How could he have let his emotions get the best of him? As the sirens grew louder in the distance, he knew that his life was about to change forever. The consequences of his actions were unavoidable. The moment he had taken someone's life, his world, their world, had shattered. He couldn't undo it. He couldn't take it back. It didn't take long for the police to arrive at the cafe. The once bustling space was now filled with flashing lights and the quiet murmurs of officers speaking into radios. The man sat in the corner, his hands still shaking, his head bowed in what seemed like a trance. It was only then, with the full weight of the situation crashing down on him, that he truly understood the gravity of what he had done. The officers didn't speak to him immediately. They went straight to the victim, confirming what they had feared. The girl, no, the woman, was dead. Her life had been taken in an act of rage, in a moment of overwhelming emotion that no one, not even the killer, fully understood. Her body was cold, her face frozen in a look of confusion, as if she had never believed this would happen. The investigation began swiftly, the detectives piecing together the timeline from the cafe's security footage. The man's face was clearly visible, his shock and confusion written all over it. But there was something off about his demeanor. He didn't seem as remorseful as one would expect. It was as though he had been disconnected from the reality of his actions, as if the shock hadn't fully worn off. As they questioned him, he was evasive at first, unable to clearly articulate what had happened. The detectives pressed him, asking the same questions again and again, but his answers didn't match up. His guilt, his fear, it was all there. But there was also a coldness, a lack of realization about what he had done. It was becoming clear that this was no random act of violence. It was premeditated, even if he hadn't fully planned it. The tension grew, and with it, the realization that the truth was more complex than anyone could have anticipated. The trial was a media sensation. A young man, so full of promise, had murdered the woman he loved in cold blood. The courtroom was packed every day, the public clamoring for answers. What had driven him to this extreme? Was it love gone wrong? Or was there something more to the story? The defense tried to argue that the man was simply overwhelmed by the shock of the revelation. He had been betrayed, they said, and in a moment of emotional instability, he had acted out in a way that no one could have predicted. The idea that his love had been shattered so violently pushed him over the edge. But the prosecution wasn't having it. They painted him as a man who had never truly loved her, who had built an idealized version of her in his mind and couldn't accept the reality of who she was. The betrayal wasn't just about gender, it was about his inability to accept her as she was, a person with her own complexities and truths. The victim's family sat in the front row, their grief palpable. They had lost a daughter, a sister, to a man who had once claimed to love her. Their testimony was heartbreaking, each family member speaking about the woman they knew, the joy she had brought into their lives, and the devastation they now faced. The man sat quietly throughout most of the trial, his face void of expression, his eyes hollow. He was trying to maintain composure, but his internal struggle was evident. Was he truly remorseful? Or was this the cold face of someone who simply couldn't grasp the enormity of what he had done? As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury was left to wrestle with the most difficult question. Was it an act of passion, or was it something much darker? The verdict came after days of deliberation, and the courtroom sat in tense silence as the judge read the decision. Guilty. The man was convicted of second-degree murder, the act of a momentary rage resulting in a life taken. The sentence was harsh, years behind bars, a life forever changed, but it wasn't just the punishment that weighed on him. It was the recognition that he would spend the rest of his life carrying the emotional weight of what he had done. He had gone to Texas seeking love, seeking connection, but what he found was his own inability to accept the truth. He couldn't bear the reality of the woman he had fallen in love with. His idealized image of her was shattered in an instant, and the betrayal, however real or imagined, consumed him. For the victim's family, the conviction was bittersweet. The woman they had known was gone, and no amount of justice could bring her back. But at least they felt the truth had been uncovered. The man who had taken her life was now held accountable for his actions. As the man was escorted out of the courtroom, the audience was left with one haunting question. How many lives are destroyed when we refuse to see people for who they truly are? How many relationships can survive the weight of expectations, of ideals, of lies we tell ourselves? This story was one of love turned deadly, of how the truth, no matter how painful, can sometimes be more than we're willing to accept.